Perfect masonry, 5 stories tall, walls aligned to the sun. 800 years of silence in a canyon that should never have been built in at all. The textbooks tell you a civilization rose here, the most sophisticated culture north of Mexico, a peaceful farming people who worship the corn and the seasons. Music. And then around the year 1200, they vanished, walked into the desert, and disappeared. For a century and a half, that was the story, a mystery with no ending. Then the bones were finally read, and when the science came back, almost every part of that story came apart in the hands of the people who had told it. The Anasazi were not who we were told they were. The disappearance everyone agreed on never actually happened. And what replaced the mystery is stranger than vanishing. It had been sitting in plain sight the entire time. To understand what the science overturned, you have to first stand in the place it overturned. And that means looking hard at a canyon that makes no sense. Chaco Canyon sits in the high desert of northwestern New Mexico, a shallow cut of sandstone about 9 miles long, surrounded by almost nothing. No river of any consequence, no fertile valley, no obvious reason looking at it today why anyone would choose to build there at all. And yet between roughly 900 and 1150, this empty seam of stone became the political, religious, and architectural center of a civilization that reached across some 90,000 square miles, an area larger than the whole of Ireland. They built great houses, more than 150 of them, massive stone structures rising as high as 5 stories, some holding more than 600 rooms, raised to a standard of masonry that modern builders still find difficult to match. The walls were engineered with rubble cores, faced in precisely cut sandstone veneer, fitted so cleanly the joints still hold. This was not the work of people improvising shelter. This was design, and the design reached for the sky. The rooms and walls were laid out to track the movements of the sun and the moon across cycles that take decades to complete. High on Fajata, but a spiral carved into the rock catches a blade of light that marks the summer solstice to within a matter of minutes. Someone stood in that desert, watched the heavens for a generation, and built the sky into the stone. Then they connected it all. A network of roads ran out from the canyon, some of them 30 feet wide, cut in lines so straight they seemed drawn with a ruler across hundreds of miles of broken country. These were not trade routes in any ordinary sense. They climbed cliffs instead of going around them. They were built to say something about the people who made them, not simply to carry goods from one place to another. And at the heart of every great house sat the Kas, circular, sunken, ceremonial chambers built down into the earth. Music. Some small enough for a handful of people, some large enough to hold hundreds at once. These were the gathering places, the rooms where whatever bound this civilization together was renewed, generation after generation, for nearly 300 years. By every measure we have, Chaco was extraordinary. The planning, the engineering, the astronomy fixed into the architecture, the sheer scale of coordinated labor it would take to quarry the stone, raise the walls, and cut the roads across that distance. This was not a loose scattering of farming villages. This was something organized, something with a mind behind it. And then, around the year 1200, it ended. Not gradually, not slowly. The great houses were abandoned within a few generations. The roads fell silent. The population that had built one of the most ambitious construction projects in the history of ancient North America simply walked away and left it all standing. Perfect masonry, 5-story walls, ceremonial chambers still holding their objects empty. For a long time, this was treated as one of the great mysteries of American archaeology. The buildings were too good, too deliberate, too carefully aligned to have been abandoned on a whim. So the questions hung in the dry air. What had happened here? Where had everyone gone? The answer that settled into the textbooks across the 20th century was a reassuring one. It was tidy. A civilization rose. It said a civilization vanished. Here are the ruins they left behind. And for most of 100 years, that was the story told in museums, printed on placards, repeated in documentaries, and taught to generations of school children as settled fact. There was only one problem with it. Almost every part of that story had been written before anyone could read the one piece of evidence that mattered most. Not the pottery, not the walls, the people themselves lying beneath the floors of the great houses waiting to be heard. For most of the last 100 years, the picture of these people was a comfortable one. They were peaceful farmers, egalitarian, democratic, very nearly utopian. A people who worshipped the sun and the corn and the turning of the seasons, who lived in balance with the land and with each other, and who, for reasons no one could quite name, eventually scattered into the wider desert and faded out of history. They were given a name borrowed from the Navajo language, Anasi, a word now understood to carry uncomfortable meanings, which is why many archaeologists today prefer ancestral Pueblo on. But for most of the 20th century, Anasazi was the name fixed to the mystery, and the mystery had a tidy shape. A civilization rose. A civilization vanished. Here are the ruins, and it is worth being fair to the people who built that picture, because they were not careless. They studied the shape of a corn-grinding stone. They read the style of a painted vessel. They measured the walls and mapped the roads. They did the best work the evidence allowed. But the most important evidence of all was one they could not yet touch. The bodies themselves, buried beneath the floors of the great houses, held a record no pottery could give, and the tools to read it did not exist. So the peaceful farmer story was written in good faith in the absence of the one witness who could contradict it. Then the tools arrived. In the 2010s, ancient DNA sequencing reached a level of precision that allowed researchers to pull readable genetic material from Chicoan bones that had been sitting in museum drawers since the 1890s. The first of these skeletons came from a place inside Pueblo Bonito, known as Room 33, a small walled crypt at the heart of the grandest great house in the canyon, holding the remains of 14 people, surrounded by extraordinary wealth. Reed mats, conch, shell trumpets carried from the Pacific coast, turquoise by the thousands of pieces. A team led by the archaeologist Douglas Kennett, working with Stephen Plow and their colleagues, published what they found in 2017, and it did not fit the peaceful, leaderless story at all. 9 of the individuals in that crypt shared the exact same mitochondrial genome. Mitochondrial DNA passes only from mother to child, so an identical signature meant these were not strangers laid together by chance. They were one family, joined through the female line. The nuclear DNA went further still. It identified a mother and daughter buried in the same room, and a grandmother and grandson separated in death, but bound by blood. These people had not been buried side by side over a single hard winter. The dates stretched across roughly 330 years. For more than 3 centuries, One lineage had held the most sacred ground in the canyon and passed it down through its mothers. This was not a community of equals. This was a dynasty. The textbooks had described a people without rulers. The DNA described a ruling house. It is important to be honest about the limits because good science states them plainly. Only 9 of the 14 bodies yielded usable DNA. Some researchers have cautioned that 9 individuals from a single room cannot on their own speak for the social order of a civilization that spanned 90,000 square miles. They are right to say so. But the finding does something the old story could not survive. It puts inherited power, held by one family across 10 generations, at the very center of a society that had been called egalitarian for 100 years. And once that pillar fell, the whole structure was open to question. The wealth in that crypt had to come from somewhere. The turquoise, the shells from a distant ocean, the trumpets. A small farming village does not gather treasure like that by accident. It gathers it through reach, through trade lines running far beyond the desert. And when researchers followed where those treasures had come from, the trail did not lead deeper into the southwest. It led south. Some had traveled more than 1,000 miles to reach the canyon, and the direction they came from matters for everything that follows. From Mesoamerica, from the great civilizations of central Mexico. Start with the things you can hold. Among the goods that begin appearing at Chaco during its golden age are the feathers of scarlet macaws, birds that live only in the tropical lowlands far to the south. There are copper bells cast in the metallurgical tradition of Mesoamerica, a craft that had no roots anywhere in the southwest. And there is chocolate. Biochemical analysis of residue inside Chacoan vessels turned up cacao, harvested from a plant that grows more than 1,000 miles away in the tropics. People in this dry northern canyon were drinking a beverage prepared from a crop they could not possibly have grown. Someone was carrying it to them. Then there is the architecture, and here the influence becomes harder to wave away. At Wupatki, on the western edge of the Chacoan world, archaeologists found a ball court, not a rough local approximation of one, an actual Mesoamerican ball court of the kind built for the ritual games played across the Valley of Mexico for more than 1,000 years. There was no tradition of ball courts anywhere in the Southwest. No earlier, simpler version that might have grown into it over time. It appears fully formed, as though it had been carried north and set down whole. Inside Chaco Canyon itself, at the great house called Citro Kettle, a row of columns was raised along a ceremonial wall, a colonnade matching the temple facades of Mesoamerica, hundreds of miles to the south. No one else in the surrounding desert was building anything like it. And at some later point, someone filled the spaces between those columns in as though the signature had become something to hide. But the original construction was unmistakable. And then there are the teeth. In the elite burials of Pueblo Bonito, among the dynasty already pulled from the dark, researchers found a single filed tooth, a specific style of dental modification common across Mesoamerica and completely unknown anywhere north of Mexico, not in the southwest, not in the Great Basin, not on the plains. And yet there it sat in the mouth of a high-status Chacan. It is tempting to read all of this as a single dramatic event, an invasion, a foreign elite arriving to seize the canyon and rule it. And some researchers have argued for exactly that. But it is important to be careful here, because the evidence supports a quieter and more honest claim. What the Macaos and the copper and the cacao establish beyond reasonable doubt is sustained long distance ants contact. The flow of prestige goods, of ideas, of architectural knowledge, and very possibly of a few individuals across an enormous span of country. What it does not prove on the genetics we actually have is a migrant dynasty replacing the bloodline of the canyon. The DNA from Chaco points to deep local continuity, not a southern takeover. The stronger story, the one where Mesoamerica conquers the Southwest, is interpretation, and it remains contested. But contact alone is enough to change the picture. Because ideas travel along trade routes just as surely as feathers and bells do. And the world those goods came from was not only a world of astronomers and architects and metal workers. It was a world with a particular way of understanding the universe. A worldview in which the cosmos was not simply observed, but fed. In which order had to be maintained through ritual, and ritual sometimes required the most extreme offering a human community can make. Whether that worldview traveled north with the macaw and the cacao is one of the most difficult questions in all of southwestern archaeology. The trade goods are certain. The architecture is certain. What rode along beside them in the minds of the people who carried them is not. And the reason that question matters is that alongside the treasures, the canyon left behind something else, something one man spent 30 years refusing to look away from. For more than 30 years, one man insisted on looking at what almost everyone else preferred to ignore. His name was Christy Turner. He was a physical anthropologist trained in forensic work, and he knew the difference between bones that had been laid to rest and bones that had been treated as something else. When Turner examined skeletal collections from Chaco and its surrounding great houses, he saw a pattern that did not fit the peaceful farmer's story at all. The bones had not been buried. They had been processed, dismembered, broken open, burned, and scattered. And the damage on them matched, with disturbing precision, the damage found on the bones of animals that had been butchered for food. So Turner built a test. He assembled a forensic checklist of 6 criteria that all had to be present before he would draw any conclusion. Burning on the backs of skulls, but not the faces. The mark of a head set on a fire. Anvil abrasion. The scraping left when a bone is smashed between 2 stones to reach the marrow. Cut marks from stone tools at the joints where tendon meets bone. Pot polish. A faint sheen left on fragments stirred inside a ceramic vessel. Fracture patterns from breaking fresh bone rather than old. And most damning, the systematic absence of the vertebrae, the richest source of marrow in the body. Pulverized and gone. Applied across dozens of Chicoan sites, the checklist returned nearly 300 individuals who met the full criteria. Men, women, children, processed in the same way these people processed deer and rabbit. For 20 years, critics held a single line against him. Butchering is not eating. A body could be cut apart for any number of reasons without the flesh ever being consumed. The distinction mattered, and it refused to close. It closed in 2000 at a site called Cowboy Wash in southwestern Colorado. There, researchers led by Richard Marler working with Brian Billman, Patricia Lambert, and their colleagues found the remains of 7 people, processed to every one of the 6 criteria. And in a hearth at the center of the site, alongside the cooking vessels, they found a copperite, preserved human waste left at the scene. Marler designed a test for a single protein, human myoglobin, found only in human skeletal muscle and present nowhere in the gut of a person who has eaten plants or ordinary game. The test came back positive in the coprolite and on a cooking pot, while 20 control samples from comparable sites came back clean. The conclusion published in the journal Nature was as direct as the science allowed. Someone at Cowboy Wash had eaten human flesh. Here the story has to be told carefully and honestly. The PBLO descendant communities, the Hopi, the Zuri, the Acoma, and the Rio Grande PBLO, have contested this interpretation for decades, and their objection deserves real weight, not a footnote. They have pointed out correctly that accusations of cannibalism have been used throughout American history to dehumanize native peoples. They have argued that forensic evidence can record that an event happened but cannot recover what it meant. And they have insisted that whatever took place in those rooms was done to their ancestors, not by a people defined by it. That distinction is the center of the question. Because the larger explanation that has grown around these bones, the idea of an imported Mesoamerican religion of terror administered by a foreign priesthood, is interpretation. It is one reading, and it remains disputed. The genetics do not confirm it. What the bones confirm is narrower, and it is enough. What they confirm is this. The signature is not scattered randomly. It is concentrated. It clusters in and around the great houses, the ceremonial heart of the Chacoan world, and it tracks the canyon's own lifespan with unsettling closeness. The pattern rises as Chaco rises. It holds through the centuries of the great houses, and it begins to fade almost exactly when Chaco itself begins to fall. Whatever this was, it belonged to Chaco, and it ended when Chaco ended. Which raises the question, everything has been building toward. What ended Chaco? The end did not arrive from a single direction. It came from several at once, and the first of them was written in the rings of trees. Across the four corners, the wood that has survived from this period carries a year-by-year record of rainfall laid down ring by ring for more than 1,000 years. Read carefully, it shows that the warmer, wetter trend that had sustained Chicoan farming for the better part of 3 centuries broke in the middle of the 12th century. Between roughly 1130 and 1180, the Southwest entered a long drought. The winters turned colder, the summers turned drier, and the rainfall that had let Chacoan farmers grow maize at altitudes and in soils that should never have supported it began to fail season after season in a pattern that lasted long enough to break the foundation of everything built on top of it. Chaco had always been vulnerable to exactly this. The canyon itself had no reliable water. The great houses, the roads, the ceremonial centers had never fed themselves. They were sustained by an immense coordinated effort to move food and materials inward from the outlying regions to the ritual core. It was a system that worked only as long as the edges produced a surplus, and when the edges could no longer grow enough to feed even themselves, the tribute stopped flowing. The coordination that had held 90,000 square miles together began to come apart. Then the second signal appeared, and this one is visible in the bones. The processed remains, the signature that had recurred in the Chacoan record for more than 200 years, begin to vanish almost exactly when the drought begins. The latest assemblages that meet the full forensic criteria cluster tightly in the decades around 1150, and after 1180 they essentially stop. Not gradually, not slowly. The system that had produced those remains for a quarter of a millennium simply ceased to produce them at all. Something had ended. But the record will only take us so far. And it is important to be honest about where it stops. Whether the local people finally rose against the ruling lineage, whether the priests lost the authority that had let the system function, or whether the whole order dissolved under the weight of a failing food supply, the bones and the rings cannot say for certain. What they can say is what came next. The great houses were abandoned, not destroyed, not burned, not sacked by an enemy, abandoned. The people walked out and left their homes standing, the walls intact, the rooms still holding their objects as though they expected the wind to keep them, and the emptying followed a clear and traceable line. By 1200, the depopulation of the canyon was well underway. By 1250, the outlying communities were draining as well. By 1300, the Four Corners region, which had supported one of the most densely organized societies anywhere in ancient North America, was effectively empty of permanent settlement. The cays that had once held hundreds fell silent. The roads that had run dead straight across the desert were reclaimed by it. The great houses raised with such obsessive precision were left to the sun. This is the exact moment the textbook narrative settles on. The vanishing, the mystery, the lost civilization, the empty buildings, the unanswered question hanging over the ruins of where everyone had gone. For a century and a half, this was treated as the end of the story. And this is precisely where that story has always been wrong. Because abandonment is not the same as disappearance. A people who leave a place have not ceased to exist. They have gone somewhere. The question was never whether the Chicoans survived the collapse of their system. Many of them did. The question, the one that took the better part of a century to even ask properly, was simpler and stranger than the mystery ever allowed. Where did they go? They went south and east. They followed the water. The depopulation of Chaco was not a vanishing. It was a migration. The people who had lived under the Chacoan system, who had endured whatever happened in those great houses across 2.5 centuries, did not walk into the desert and dissolve. They walked toward the rivers that still ran down to the Rio Grande, to the Little Colorado, to the Mia's farming was still possible in a drying world. They carried with them everything that had let their ancestors survive in the first place. The knowledge of how to grow maize in hard country, the reading of the sky, the masonry. And they left behind the ceremonial centers of a system that had, for whatever reason, stopped being worth carrying. For more than 600 years, the record of where they went was held in one place, and one place only. The oral traditions of their descendants, the Hopi, the Zuri, the Ioma, the Rio Grande PBLO, all of whom had said consistently and for generations that the people of the great houses were their own ancestors, that no one had ever truly disappeared. And for most of those 6 centuries, the academic world declined to treat those traditions as evidence. They were stories. It was decided memory, not history. Then the genetics caught up to what the descendants had been saying all along. In 2025, a study published in the journal Nature did something the field had never managed before. It was led by researchers working in full partnership with the Picures PBLO, a community in northern New Mexico, on a project the tribe itself had initiated and controlled. The team compared the DNA of living Pacurus people with ancient DNA from individuals buried in their own territory across the last several centuries. And the result was a clear and unbroken line of genetic continuity, reaching back from the present day and connecting more broadly to the ancestral Puebloans of Chaco Canyon. There was no population collapse before the Europeans arrived. No replacement, no eraser, just continuity written in the body exactly where the oral traditions had always placed it. This is the finding that turns the entire story over. The Hopi and the Zuri, and the Acoma and the people of the Rio Grande Pueblo are not the distant heirs of a lost civilization. They are not what came after the Anazi. They are the Anazi farming country their ancestors farmed, carrying in their cells the biological record of the people who raised the great houses and cut the roads and aligned the walls to the sun. And so the mystery dissolves, and what replaces it is larger and stranger and more honest than the mystery ever was. The oral histories had been accurate for 800 years. They had told the story correctly the entire time. Ancient DNA did not rediscover the Anasazi. It confirmed something that had never actually been forgotten, except by the outsiders who came later and decided the story needed an ending. That, in the end, is the part worth holding on to. The people of Chaco were not a riddle that vanished into the desert air. They were modern human beings with the same minds we carry now, who built something extraordinary in an impossible place, lived under a system we are still struggling to understand. And then when that system failed them, did the most human thing imaginable. They left. They survived. They went looking for water and they found it. And they carried their world with them to higher ground. The buildings stayed behind. The people did not. And for 150 years we mistook the silence of the empty canyon for the silence of an empty people, when their descendants were living the entire time within a few days' walk of the ruins we called a mystery. The question was never where the Anastasia went. The question was why it took the rest of us so long to notice they had never really left. Perfect masonry, 5 stories tall, walls aligned to the sun. 800 years of silence in a canyon that should never have been built in at all. For a century and a half, that silence was the whole story. The lost people, the vanished farmers, the mystery with no ending. Then the science arrived, and it took the story apart, one piece at a time. Not a people without rulers, but a dynasty held through the mothers for 300 years. Not a single peaceful myth, but something darker, contested, and real. Not a disappearance, but a migration to higher water. We handed them an ending. They never needed one. Their descendants farm the same country and carry the same blood and told the truth for 800 years. While we called it a mystery, the canyon vanished. The people did not. We are only now learning how to listen. If this story stayed with you, subscribe and turn on notifications. We cover the cases history got wrong.